Let's render some HTML with pure JavaScript. React takes the approach of generating HTML with JavaScript. It does that for many reasons. The most important ones are that we get the full power of JavaScript to work with our data. And before we generate the HTML, we can represent it as a JavaScript object tree, which allows React to compare it against future versions of the same tree and generate partial HTML nodes to take to the browser. This concept is known in React as the virtual DOM. We will write our React application under the source directory here. In index.js, to start working with React, we need to import React first. We import React from React. We also need to import React DOM since we're going to be working with the browser. We import it from React DOM. The first React DOM API that we need is to render something. So the function is render, and this function takes two arguments. The first argument is what to render. We're going to render a React element. So the API is react.createElement, and we'll come back to its arguments in a little bit. The second argument to render is where we want this element to be rendered. So we're going to render it simply in an element in the document. I'm going to use getElementById, which is a DOM API, and give it root. So in here I'm saying render it to an element in the document that has the ID root. So we don't actually have an element in the document that has an ID root. So I'm going to go under views, index.js, and I'm going to introduce a new element that has the ID root. And let's go ahead and also put this content inside the root, just like that. So this means if we initially have content, go ahead and render it. But after the JavaScript environment loads up, React is going to take over this root div and it will replace the content of the root div with the React application. This will help us when we want to do server-side rendering. So let's go back to the arguments of the createElement API method. The first argument to createElement is the HTML tag type. So let's render an h2. The second argument is any attributes that we want this h2 to have. If we don't have any attributes, we can just pass a null here. And the rest of arguments for the createElement call are all the children that we want this element to have. So let's render a simple hello React. Looks good. Now to get this working, we need to run npm run dev. This will run our webpack and generate the bundle.js file from our React source code so far. As you can see, there's a bundle.js file now generated. This bundle.js is generated under public. So just like we served about.html statically with the express static middleware, we can also serve bundle.js statically. But we do need to include this bundle.js in our HTML somewhere. Usually we include it in the footer right after everything else. So in here, we can go with a script tag and just do /bundle.js here. We also need to run our Node web server, which we can do with npm start. Looking good. Let's go ahead and test. Localhost, port 880, and we get a hello React. So as you noticed in source index.js, we actually wrote pure JavaScript. There's no HTML in here, and the result was an HTML h2 element. The return value here in react.createElement, we can actually test it. If you go to react.js.com, the official React site, and open up a console, React is globally available here, so we can test it. So react.createElement h2 is going to give us a simple object. This object has many properties, but the most important properties are the type of the object, which is an h2, and the props property, which has a children property that holds the text that we just rendered. So with React, we simply describe HTML elements as objects, and then React put them together into a tree. And it keeps a copy of this tree in memory. So when things change, React will recalculate the tree and actually compare trees. And it takes to the browser only the difference between the new tree and the old tree. And this makes React very efficient. However, working with React API like this is not very pleasant because we're very used to HTML. This is why we can use JSX. So with JSX, we get to actually write HTML in here. Just like that. Same thing. Hello React with JSX. This will just work because we configured Babel to actually compile this code into React. So you can test, and it's working. And with this approach, we get to write the familiar HTML, but we also get the benefits of the React virtual DOM. With JSX also, we get to use JavaScript variables. So I can do math.random here, just like that. And every time I refresh, I'm going to get a different random value. So inside those curly braces, I can put any JavaScript expression. And this way we have the full power of JavaScript itself to generate the HTML. Let me actually show you an example of that. I'm going to put these on multiple lines, and I'm going to go ahead and create a variable color. And this is going to depend on the math.random value. So I'm going to take the math.random value, and I'm going to do a condition here. If math.random is greater than 0.5, I want the color to be green. Otherwise, I want it to be red. So this is a simple ternary statement, and I'm going to go ahead and use it. In H2 here, I can pass a style object, and this style object could be a variable. And we pass an object here inside that variable. So we can do any CSS style in here. So I'm going to go ahead and do color is color. And with this, the color for the H2 element is going to be randomly selected. Sometimes it's going to be green, sometimes it's going to be red. Let's go ahead and test. Green, green, red. And by the way, we can omit this part because it matches, so we can just do color in here. So you see how we have the full power of JavaScript to control the HTML that we write to the browser. Let's clean up this example. So JSX is really similar to HTML. There are a few very subtle differences. For example, if you want to pass a class to this element, you can't just do class. You have to do class name. So for example, text center here, that's the class name to center a text in Bootstrap. And let's make sure that this is working. Let me remove the math.random part. So we go with class name because the DOM API is actually class name. So for example, if you do document.getElementById for our root element, this is a DOM element. Let's go ahead and put it in a variable, DE. So now if we want to do stuff on DE, for example, if I want to change the class name of DE, this is the DOM API. I can do class name, there's classless, there's plenty of other APIs that you want to explore. So React actually uses the same thing as the DOM API. So it's class name and not class.